Awesome. All right. So in order to start to think about this, right, we have to start to think about what is it that we mean when we say sex and what is it that we mean when we say gender. Related to this is the whole question of how male and female interact and what are the differences between male and female. I'll touch on those a little bit in my talks, but that would really be something more for Q&A if people have questions. In this talk, I'm going to talk about this word gender. We're going to look at a bit of its history in linguistics. We're going to look at how psychology took over that use, and then in particular, how something called gender identity theory, or sometimes in the Catholic world, gender ideology, how that way of thinking runs with this understanding of gender, and just touch on whether or not we should keep the term, and I'll talk more about the term gender tomorrow. So originally, gender is a linguistic term. If you've learned other foreign languages, especially anything based on Latin, any Romance language, you know that when you memorize a noun, what it means, you also have to memorize what gender it is, right? And so it might be maybe masculine and feminine. It might also have neuter. This example gave the language of Uganda, which I know nothing about, but which apparently has all kinds of other ways of classifying nouns. Apparently, English used to do this as well, but at some point that dropped out. But you see an example of this, for example, in German. So the word for sun, what's in the sky, is die Sonne, which is feminine. The word for moon is der Mond. Now, often in our in our mythology, we think of the moon as feminine and the sun maybe as more masculine. And so this example shows you that the way we think of something as being maybe typically feminine or typically masculine does not necessarily line up with how it presents in the language. But so originally this word gender was linguistic, and as John Grabowski, whom both Dr. Pedraza and I know, talks about, we began to use this word more and more to talk about sexual difference. In other words, to talk about male and female. And so Dr. Grabowski explains this in the sense that gender used to be the common word for describing sexual difference because one did not say sex in polite company. I don't know if you remember that when we didn't say sex in polite company. I remember when I was, probably in elementary school maybe, and, somebody would say like, well, what's your sex? And then there'd be some stupid boy who'd be like, lots of it or something. And I'd just be like, oh my gosh, you're so immature. And so then you would have to rephrase it, right? It'd be like, okay, what's your gender, right? So everybody knew you were talking about male or female as opposed to human intercourse or something. So gender began to be used more and more to specify male or female. The root of the word is, whether you look at it as a noun or as a verb, it has to do with generation, with kin. And so in Greek, when you have all of the things in the Bible, Abraham begat Isaac and Isaac begat Jacob and all of that, that beget word, the root of that in Greek is this G-E-N word. So it has this sense, it's related to some of these other words that we see there on the right that have this sense of generosity, of fruitfulness, of children, of kinship, right? So even the word itself is full of this, it's pregnant in that sense, right? It's full of these meanings of progeny, of children. So what happened? How did we get from gender being linguistic and having kind of this range of meanings centering around progeny to getting to where we are today, where gender means something like the gender unicorn, which we'll look at, or the rainbow flag or something. So how does this transition happen? So first you have to go back to Simone de Beauvoir. So in about 70 years ago, she begins writing on what it means to be a woman. And this phrase, which is sort of a motto within postmodern gender theory. It's kind of if they were to have a postmodern gender theory t-shirt, this would be on it, right? This idea that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And so what she was emphasizing there is that being a woman is like fraught with these cultural meanings. And it's not just a simple matter of what we would say maybe biology, but that it's actually this whole cultural phenomenon. So this thread gets picked up by a psychologist named John Money, who I think died about 15 years ago, maybe. He was important in establishing the first gender identity clinic, which was at Johns Hopkins University. And back then, what we call intersex conditions were called hermaphroditism. So people who, because of either genetic or hormonal or some complicated interplay between those factors, were not born with clear male or female genitalia. Now, a lot of people just instinctively assume that when we're talking about transgenderism or we're talking about people who identify as queer or something, that there's something like intersex conditions at play, and that is actually not true. So you want to separate out intersex conditions from things like transgenderism, because often people who are intersex are not thinking of themselves in transgender terms at all. So they're kind of distinct issues. But as part of thinking about this, one of the things that was developed in this clinic was the possibility of sex reassignment surgery for infants in, for example, a case where somebody might, for example, have ambiguous chromosomes, not either simply XX or XY, but ambiguous, that would result in ambiguous sexual organs. What Money does, though, so you can see, I'm not actually a bioethicist, I don't work in that particular field, but you can see that those are very complicated situations, right? Like somebody, like you're trying to do your best for this person who is not able to know, you're not able to know clearly what their sex is if they're male or female. Money takes the situation of those people, which is quite small. This is very few people who are born like this. He expanded it pretty much to the whole human race. And so Money's idea was that what he called gender is intrinsically malleable. He said for basically the first 2 years after you're born, that gender is malleable for everybody. And it's very socially malleable. In other words, it's a matter of social pressures that gender you in a certain way as either male or female. And so if you apply different social pressures, somebody who would be raised as a boy, say, could otherwise be raised as a girl and completely assume that identity. So his most famous case, which he wrote about, was the case of David Reamer, which he touted. Money touted this case as a success. So there in the top you have a picture of David, who then was being raised as Brenda, and his twin Brian. So there were these twin boys who were born, Bruce, who later be called Brenda, and then David, and then Brian. So these twin boys were born, and because of a need to have surgery on Brian's surgery went fine, but Bruce's surgery was botched and left Bruce with a damaged penis. And the parents didn't know what to do. So he wasn't, in other words, he wasn't born this way. It's something that happened after the fact. They went to Johns Hopkins, to the clinic, and Dr. Money advocated the easiest thing to do medically, surgically, was to remove his penis. And so Dr. Money advocated that the parents raise him as a girl. And this was a way of testing his hypothesis, right? That gender is really malleable. You just change the external genitalia and raise Bruce as Brenda. So on the bottom left there, you see a picture of him as a toddler being raised as Brenda. There were some icky things around this as well that came out that, for example, Money apparently had Brian and Brenda do sexual play acting when they were young kids, which was no doubt very inappropriate and quite traumatizing to them. Even though Money said that this was a success, the person who called himself later David never felt like a girl. And he had a kind of early adolescent meltdown and was going through a lot of difficulties. And at that point, the truth came out when he was 14. And so that's when he changed his name to David as a kind of like David and Goliath kind of symbolism. And so you see the picture on the bottom right where he started to present again as a boy. He ended up committing suicide at the age 38. His twin brother, a few years before, committed suicide. So there was clearly a lot of family trauma because of this whole situation. So this is what Money said in 1975 about David Reamer. The girl, meaning David Reamer, already preferred dresses to pants, enjoyed wearing her hair in ribbons, bracelets, and frilly blouses, and loved being her daddy's little sweetheart. Throughout childhood, her stubbornness and the abundant physical energy she shared with her twin brother and expends freely have made her a tomboyish girl, but nonetheless a girl. So according to David and according to his parents, this was actually not the case. That the first time his parents tried to put a frilly dress on him, he ripped it off, he was really mad, that he never felt comfortable. And later, I think he was on Oprah or something, he said this, that when he learned that, the whole story, right, and that he was a boy, he said, it all made sense why I felt the way I did. I wasn't some sort of weirdo. I wasn't crazy. So even though the results of this experiment were not what Money said they were, this was taken as evidence of gender really being malleable the way that Money said that it was. So that's part of the linguistic and the psychological history. In the 70s and 80s, second wave feminism, which basically means feminism after the suffragettes, second wave feminism takes up this word gender. And they use it to describe a distinction that was really important for feminist goals. The idea was that sex has to do with what we would say biology, whereas gender has to do with culture. And the reason that's so helpful for a feminist project is that if you have, say, cultural stereotypes around being male or around being female, those are not set in stone, right? Those really are changeable. So, if you're a feminist and you're concerned that people are saying that, women can't be mathematicians or something, you can say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with sex, with biology. That just has to do with stereotypes, right? And so this distinction came about using this language of gender. And I think that this is a helpful distinction, right? Because, you can think right now, in Scotland, apparently, it's a manly thing to wear skirts, I guess, right? You can think of all kinds of things like that, right? Where in one culture something is manly, that in another culture is feminine, or vice versa. And, obviously there's nothing intrinsic about wearing skirts per se, one way or the other, that we really care that much about. There's nothing set in stone, right? And so this distinction was really helpful. The thing is, it didn't last very long in this format within feminism, because if you know a history of feminism at all, you know that after second wave feminism, we have third wave feminism, and the next person I'm going to talk about is really representative of that. And that is Judith Butler, who is really single-handedly responsible for creating the whole category of gender theory or queer theory. You might remember back in the day, like I grew up in a university town. Can you guys hear me, by the way? Okay, good. No, I don't think it is. I just wonder if I'm not like being, yelling enough or something. I grew up in a university town, and back in the day, we had a women's studies department. It was a state university. I don't think there's a lot of women's studies departments left. They're mostly gender studies or queer studies. So this person is very important in that transition. So one of her earliest ideas is this idea that gender is a socially compelled performance. It's a performance, meaning, think about Simone de Beauvoir, right? It's about what you do. You're not born a woman, you have to become one, right? So you act your way into being a woman. But it's socially compelled, right? You don't have an option. You have to act yourself into being some sex. And for Butler, this idea of something being socially compelled was really troubling, right? It's like she wanted people to not be compelled to act in the gender that everybody said that they were in. But she doesn't stop there. What she does next is even more radical. So there's this idea that she presents that not only gender, as cultural codes, men wearing skirts, that kind of thing, not only gender is a social construct, but sex itself is. All right, this is the really radical thing that made everybody very excited in 1990 when Gender Trouble came out, that she argued that the sexed body itself was a social construct. That without social pressures and heteronormative ideas and that sort of thing, that we wouldn't view genitalia as being especially relevant for sex, as being especially relevant for sexual pleasure. She talks very little about reproduction, as you might expect from this kind of understanding, right? So in other words, everything about us is socially constructed all the way down, even our body. And so here's one example of this idea that female no longer appears to be a stable notion. Its meaning is as troubled and unfixed as woman. So this idea that not only do you have gender social construction, but you actually have the sexed body being socially constructed. Now, to believe this, you have to think that we're pretty different from other higher animals, all of which are sexed as male and female, right? Like you have to think that there's kind of a big gap between us and the other animals. You also have to think that the way we talk and the kind of relations of power that go on to compel these performances, that these are really the whole story. In other words, if somebody addresses you as a certain way, that has real power. And if you don't like how they address you, you have to fight back. Sometimes when I give these talks, people are like, I don't understand why, something, so I don't know if you've heard of misgendering. That's so if somebody comes up and says, I'm Harry, but what's on the birth certificate is Rebecca, and you forget and you say Rebecca, that's like dead naming the person or misgendering them, and they'll usually, that gets quite an emotional response from the person if you do that. And for a lot of people, that's very confusing because it's like, I just made a mistake, or I forgot, or it's just words, why does it matter? Well, in this kind of way of thinking, words are really everything. Words really set the tone for what is and is not. And so if you manage the language game, you are like, that's like a power play, right? You're in control. And so that's thinking that's really set into motion by Judith Butler. So what you have today, so here we have the gender unicorn. These kept changing, because like for a while there was like a genderbread man, which looked like a gingerbread man, but people are like, it's too human, or it's already looks too male or too female, so like it's hard to keep up. But I think the gender unicorn is the most recent. This idea is that there's all kinds of things going on that have to do with gender, and they're really all equally valid or important or unimportant. Like they're all in play. And so here you get language, as you see here, of gender identity. And so this is often, usually defined, as I have it here, as one's sense of self, right? I identify as, I have a sense that I am a man, that I'm a woman, or that I'm something else altogether. So that's this inner sense of self. But yet, you also have this language, this idea that gender is not something inner, it's something outer, right? Gender is a social construct. It has to do with how people view you, right? And so there's this tension about whether gender is this deeply interior thing or actually this oppressive social thing. So this is part of the equivocation that goes on with gender identity theory. Notice that in the middle here you have sex assigned at birth, which is basically one more item among other things like same or opposite sex attraction, gender identity. And in fact, as we're going to see, especially I think tomorrow, sex assigned at birth is considered one of the least important aspects. And so what they mean by this, of course, is that, you know, the baby comes out of the womb, or, you know, maybe even you see it on the ultrasound, but let's just say the baby comes out of the womb and the doctor says, congratulations, you have a boy. How did he know it was a boy? He looked at the genitalia, right? You know, so like that's the idea that, like, well, the doctor is assigning a sex at birth by looking at the genitalia, but the baby cannot really be consulted about the baby's intergender identity, right? And so, like, you have this sex assigned at birth, but it's kind of put in brackets because that's, you know, that's the culture, but we have to wait and see what the person really thinks or feels. All right, so gender identity. So here we can see that the thing that is most important, and we're going to see this shortly in some examples, the thing that is really real is the gender side of things. In other words, how people identify, how they feel, what they believe themselves to be. That is the thing that is real. The thing that is considered to be the construct, to be artificial and kind of imposed, is sex. In other words, male or female, as part of your body. Okay, so you're seeing this move away from the body as being real, and what takes its place are feelings or thoughts or impressions. So we have, in fact, a dual divide. So the first divide is, so, you know, the second wave feminists made a distinction between gender and sex, but as the decades wore on, that distinction began to be a divide, where now gender, my sense of things or how I live out being a woman, say, in my particular cultural surrounding, now that doesn't have to have anything to do with the sexed body, right? The gender is something that floats free of the sexed body. The second divide is that sex itself is no longer really in the body. If you go, you know, 100% Judith Butler, you think that, like, sex itself is really socially constructed, and that the body itself doesn't necessarily have to mean one sex or the other at all. So you start to see these divisions entering into how we think about sex and gender. So here's a quick summary of what I talked about. So I left off Simone de Beauvoir, but we'll start with Money, with John Money. So this idea that gender can be used to talk about what's socially constructed, that it is malleable in the first years, and that he tried to, you know, use this situation of the Reamer twins, which really kind of fell in his lap and was like this gift to him in a sense, like, no, now I can test my theories. We saw that he tried and failed, like he really tried hard to make that work, and that failed. We saw with the second wave feminists that they started to make a distinction between sex as biological and gender as the cultural and social trappings around sex. But that this became a split, where gender starts to float free from sex, where it's no longer that, well, I'm biologically a woman and I live that out by being a mother, but also by being a professor, you know, maybe doing some feminine things, typically feminine things, but then doing typically masculine things. You know, I garden, but I also watch football or whatever. You know, instead of kind of viewing sex and gender as holding together, that those began to split. Then with Judith Butler, gender is socially constructed, but sex is as well. So this is, when people say postmodern, sometimes post-structuralist, she's an example of a postmodern feminist. There are lots of feminists, by the way, who were and are very uncomfortable with the direction Butler took things, who mourn for the days of women's studies departments when you could talk about women. And that's kind of problematized now. So there's this kind of quiet but significant cohort of kind of old school feminists who do not approve of the direction things have gone in. But with Butler, kind of, you can summarize this idea where nothing is really natural. Everything is socially constructed. And then now with the gender unicorn, this new understanding of the human person, where sex is a construct, but gender identity is real. Right? Gender identity is the thing we have to listen to. All right, so here's some examples using the Associated Press style book, and I'm indebted, by the way, to Abigail Favali for many of the images in this PowerPoint. So you can see on the right there, on the top paragraph, use the term sex or gender assigned at birth instead of biological sex, birth gender, was identified as birth at, born a girl, and so forth. So the AP, so these are people who are working for the Associated Press news service, are expected to follow this style book, right? So if you started to see this kind of language in newspapers or, you know, in popular surroundings, not just, you know, people on social media or something, but in newspapers, this is because this is the thing that's being dictated, that this is what reporters should do. So keep in mind that this language of sex assigned at birth was originally used in those situations of those complicated intersex conditions where doctors really had to work with parents and figure out how, you know, what sex made the most sense based on this very particular complicated issue. Now the assumption is that all of us are more or less like that, where we're all having our sex assigned at birth. So everybody is born sexually ambiguous, not just the 0.001% or whatever it is of people with intersex conditions. But there's a question here that is something we need to start to ask, because there's a tension in this elevation of gender identity. There's a tension within the whole gender thinking. And that is that we're frequently told the gender is fluid. So you probably have heard this, right? The gender is fluid. I remember reading something by someone who, it was maybe the genderbread person. I can't remember which iteration it was. But he was like, you know, I wake up and I'm like feeling energetic and I'm male. And then, you know, maybe later in the day I'm feeling kind of flirtatious and kind of like a cat, and so then I'm female. And it was like designed to show how like gender wasn't this fixed thing, but it was very fluid. But okay, if that's the case, then why is it that the kind of medical and surgical therapies that are recommended for people in that situation, why are these very, very permanent? And why do they impact the body so deeply? Like why, if we really believe gender is fluid, then why can't we just let people kind of flow back and forth and not really care what happens to their bodies? So that's another tension within this way of thinking. So I talked about the tension between gender identity being internal or being something socially constructed. And then there's also this tension between gender being fluid and gender being something like really stable and strong and fixed and like my real me. Okay, so that's another tension. Here's a little bit more. And so you see the one of these contradictions here in the AP style book when it's talking about gender versus the term gender identity. So gender is a social construct encompassing a person's behaviors, intrinsic identity, and appearance. So that's all kind of internal language, right? It's like how I behave, it's how I identify, it's how I appear. But it says here that it's a social construct, right? It's a social construct that has to do with these kinds of things. On the other side of the screen, we have gender identity, a person's sense of feeling male, female, or neither, or some combination of both. Often just gender will suffice. So is gender a social construct, or is it my sense of being male, female, neither, or both? Like, which is it, right? And so this is part of the incoherence within gender identity theory, that it doesn't actually really know completely what it thinks gender is. And therefore, it gives us conflicting accounts. So one of my takeaways here from this presentation is that gender identity theory depends upon an anti-realism. In other words, it emphasizes feelings and impressions, a sense of yourself, and de-emphasizes or even views as an obstacle a person's body. So we have this, war kind of being set up inside the human person, right? Where the assumption is that it's entirely possible that my deepest inner identity is completely opposed to my body. Okay? And so if you think about that kind of way of thinking, see if you can think of anything else that looks like that, right? Can you think of any other situations or psychological states where a person's internal sense of who they are is completely opposed to their body? So one of the examples that Abigail Favale gives is that of eating disorders. There's this somewhat rare psychological condition where people have this obsession about having their limbs amputated. I can't remember what that's called though. But that's something that's much more exotic for, most of us haven't encountered that. But you think of like an anorexic, for example, right? Who has a deep inner sense that she is overweight and that she must be thinner, right? And her body is at odds with that, right? In fact, her body, what the scale is saying is completely different. Right? What she looks like is completely different, right? But she has this deep inner sense that does not align with her body, and she also has a very antagonistic relationship with her body. I once did a search for I think it was just on Amazon. I did a search for the words diet war, and all of these things popped up. Right? If you just read like ordinary women's magazines, it's very interesting to see like how often language of warfare comes about, like when it comes to like women's relationships with their body, like discipline and it's just so it's a kind of thing that I think a lot of women easily fall into, but you see in an extreme form in something like anorexia. So I want you to think, as we're thinking about this, how it is we treat something like anorexia compared to how it is, especially as I'll talk tomorrow, that we treat something like gender identity disorders, right? When people's sense of their bodies, when people's sense of who they are is in conflict with what their body is, do we try to change their body? Or do we help them have a deeper, more integrated sense of themselves? Right? So I'll talk more about that tomorrow. But that's what I mean by an anti-realism. And instead, gender identity theory imposes this new realism, which is a matter of what I feel, what's my sense of myself. That becomes the new reality. Just very quickly, I'm going to talk more about medical issues tomorrow, but there's been a sharp change in treatment and how we treat gender identity disorders. So there were no pediatric gender clinics in the US prior to 2007. Now there's 60 plus, and Planned Parenthood also is very much in the gender treatment business, which is something to know. We have about 300 clinics providing hormonal treatments to minors. And then in Planned Parenthood, it's simply done on an informed consent basis, which is pretty cursory often if you look at the informed consent, what the forms actually say. And there's little to no physician oversight. People frequently talk about how they, as a teenager, were put on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, so meaning if they're female, they're put on testosterone, if they're male, they're put on estrogen. After meeting with a therapist like once or twice, so maybe 45 to 90 minutes of interaction with a therapist, and then they can be put immediately on this medicalized train. Along with this rise of medicalization, so hormones and surgery, I'll talk more about that tomorrow, there's been a changing political and legal landscape. So in 2016, sex reassignment surgery was not covered by Medicare. The understanding being that clinical evidence is inconclusive as far as whether or not it helps people, whether or not this is a real therapy. By 2022, this was proposed to now mandate what are called gender-affirming medical procedures, but there hasn't been, we don't have new evidence. We haven't had some major study that has said, no, actually now we do know that this helps. And in fact, we have quite the opposite, which I'll be talking about more tomorrow. So this is the DSM-5 TR, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual describing gender dysphoria. And in talking about the term transgender, it says that it refers to a person whose sex assigned at birth, i.e. the sex assigned at birth usually based on external genitalia, does not align with their gender identity, their psychological sense of their gender. Some people who are transgender will experience gender dysphoria, which refers to psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Though gender dysphoria often begins in childhood, some people may not experience it until after puberty or much later. So in fact, as we'll see tomorrow, the majority cohort now of people presenting for this are adolescent girls who up until 14, 15, 16, whatever, showed no sign of considering that they were male, showing any kind of extreme cross-dressing behavior or anything like that. But the idea here presented in the DSM is that that's fine, that this can come about very suddenly. It doesn't have to be persistent. Okay, so affirmative therapies. So the only kind of therapy that the DSM talks about here, the DSM-5, is gender affirmation. So all therapy is presumed to be affirmative. So what does that mean? So social affirmation, changing your name and pronouns, legal affirmation, medical affirmation, so now hormones come in, so suppressing puberty or cross-sex hormones, and or surgical affirmation. Of note, not all people who are transgender will desire all domains of gender affirmation. So this is something that's also helpful to remember, like when, for example, you have female athletes who are getting very upset that there's a male identifying as female in their locker rooms. A lot of people, I think, just assume it's like, well, I mean, they're basically thinking this guy's been castrated, right? Like, what's the problem? Actually, probably not. Like, it's actually quite likely that what they're upset about is that there's somebody with male genitalia in their locker room changing with them. Like, it's actually, I don't know if it's the most common presentation, but it's very, very common that they do not go all the way with surgery, which, I mean, personally, I'm happy about. But it does, you can see why it creates a threatening dynamic for women in locker rooms or in female prisons, for example. Okay, so in the DSM, we have affirmative therapies being presented as treatment. In the mix are the legal situations. I think you can more or less see that. So this is a map of states that have conversion therapy bans, whether total or partial. And what conversion therapy originally referred to when these bans started to be passed was banning psychological therapy that aimed to alter same-sex desires. Now, my understanding, I'm not a therapist, but my understanding is that there were very few therapists who actually claimed that they were going to able to and going to try to change same-sex desires. But in any case, this was something that over the last 30 years or so have been, these kinds of therapy have been banned in many states. Now, people who are part of, for example, this group where I got this map, so LGBT map, they argue that conversion therapy bans also ban any non-affirmative gender treatment. So to my knowledge, this has not been tested in court. I'm also not a lawyer, but that is the argument, right? That banning conversion therapy targeted towards same-sex desires also means banning any kind of therapy that is not just simply affirmative. So this is disturbing, right? If you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist, are you expected to just simply affirm if somebody comes into your office, or a pediatrician for that matter? To balance that, though, is this map. And there's actually interesting overlap. So these are states, the red states have banned gender-affirming care for youth, gender-affirming therapies, which at first were passed, some of them were passed over veto, where governors, even in pretty conservative states, vetoed those bans, and the legislators came back and overrode the vetoes. These have really picked up momentum in recent years. So this map is as of like a couple weeks ago. The orange are states that have introduced legislation to have some kind of ban on transgender affirmative therapies. We'll talk a little bit more tomorrow about why people are so concerned about that. But this means, for example, 14-year-olds using a different name and different pronouns in schools without their parents' knowledge. But more specifically, what's usually banned are medical and surgical procedures. So cross-sex hormones for minors, any kind of surgery, mastectomies for girls, so forth. So there, I mean, some of these are, for example, Oregon and New Jersey, right? Hawaii are considering some of these. So not exactly the kind of places you would consider. So there has been a backlash against the strong gender identity idea that we've seen, I think, just in the last year or two. When Utah's governor vetoed their ban on trans interventions for youth, I think he was really confident that he kind of had the zeitgeist with him. And things have really flipped, I think, just in the last year for various reasons that I can talk about. But I think, yeah, I think that it's not a simple case. It's not as simple as like this just kind of being the latest letter in the LGBTQ thing that, we're just, that it's just kind of inevitable that everybody's going to accept this. I think that a lot of people have a lot of concerns. Part of that is driven by what are called detransitioners. So people who have transitioned, very often taken hormones, very often girls who have had mastectomies, who now are 25, 28, who are like, I'm still depressed. This didn't make anything better. In fact, it made things worse. And I will never get my breasts back. I will never breastfeed my baby, right? And so this has been very powerful. Another factor that's important for healthcare professionals to know about is the rise of lawsuits. So the long-standing gender clinic in the UK was closed down in part because of a lawsuit. There is a lawsuit that was just filed in California, if I'm remembering rightly, by a detransitioner. And so concerns about informed consent, about the fact that kids are being allowed to make these really life-changing decisions without other things being treated are all being raised. So I will talk more about that tomorrow. One last thing to leave you with tonight. So I talked about the divide between the way we think and our bodies. When I talk tomorrow about Catholic anthropology, a big piece of that is this idea of integration. That a healthy human being is this body-soul complex. That for it to be a healthy human being, we really have to love that whole complex, right? We're not just minds, we're not just feelings, we're not just bodies, we're the whole complex. And that it's human maturity and health to accept all of those aspects of ourselves. So that's the thing that I think we need to pray for our culture, right? That we can have that kind of human maturity. Because I am asked, here's a few resources, a few different kinds of resources. When Harry Became Sally, which is, I think, a really dumb title, but I was not consulted, it's a really helpful overview of just kind of the philosophy, the medicine, lots of different things about around transgenderism. If you are a parent or a teacher and are concerned about young people being kind of suddenly taken up with gender issues, the Maria Kepler book I really recommend, Desist, Detrans, and Detox. It sounds a little bit like harsh. It's actually a very loving book. It's a really beautiful book. And she also has on the top of the other column a video on YouTube that you can, or a series of videos you can check out. Abigail Favale, from a Catholic perspective, wrote The Genesis of Gender. So if you're interested more in the theology, that's a really great book. There's also on the bottom of the next column a secular podcast that's really great. It's by a social worker and a psychologist. I think they really specialize in gender. They don't talk religion or theology. I don't know if they have any faith at all, but they're really thoughtful about gender, and one of them specializes in treating gender. More on the medical side, the National Catholic Bioethics Center is just really great, but they recently came out with a book called Transgender Issues in Catholic Healthcare. It also includes some model mission statements and gender policies for schools as well as for hospitals. The American College of Pediatrics is a good resource. That's an alternative to kind of the mainstream pediatrician organizations. And then the Person and Identity Project has lots of great short videos, articles focused on parents, school teachers, priests, ministers. It's a really great resource. So I'll encourage you to check those out. And with that, I think we can go to Q&A. So thank you very much for your attention.